I would like to take great pleasure welcoming our speaker, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Tanya Ajam, who is an associate professor in public policy, finance, and economics at the Stellenbosch University School of Public Leadership. Professor Ajam holds masters in business science from UCT, MA in economics from Cambridge University, and PhD in public management from UP. She also held several non-executive directorships in both private and public sector, including the Reserve Bank of South Africa. She served as a commissioner on Financial and Fiscal Commission, and she has been a senior advisor at the GTEC and a member of the Davis Tax Review Committee. She was a member of the President's Economic Advisory Council as well. And I'll hand over to Dr. Ajam to present this critical topic that we are discussing today.
Thanks a lot, Nobuntu. Thank you to all the participants who are letting me know where they're dialing in from. It always amazes me to see just how geographically we are all spread thanks to the technology. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is some research that we did on municipal supply chain. I know that some of you might come from national and provincial government, where instead of the Municipal Finance Management Act, your processes are governed by the Public Finance Management Act, but you'll find, I'm sure, a lot of similarities, and maybe you can share your experiences there. So now, if you'll bear with me, I will try and see if I can get my presentation on the screen. Just wanted to say to Elaine, nice to see you here. She's the one who twisted my arm to make this presentation. And Nobuntu, if you can just tell me once the presentation becomes visible, that would be awesome.
Definitely, I'll let you know. Yes, it is visible.
Okay, great. Just give me a second. I just want to find one thing more. Okay, so even before we start, I want to just draw your attention to the beautiful graphic on the cover of the report, which was the most fun thing about doing this report. You'll see a mouse in the middle of a maze, and there's very little cheese about, but lots of traps. And for me, this is like the perfect metaphor for what it is to try and be a head of supply chain or a CFO in the regulatory maze which local governments face. And I'll try and explain for some of you who aren't exposed to that sphere where some of these complexities arise from. So I led a team consisting of team members from SPL and outside, Melissa Buerta, Shireen de Visser, and Anthea Youngkist. So those were the team members, and I'll give you a bit more detail on the larger research project, of which supply chain was just one of the regulatory focus areas. I also want to thank our funders, Hans Seidel Foundation, and of course the municipalities themselves and the officials who gave up their time to participate in the research. So this research is quite important for us at SPL. I also am the academic head of the postgraduate diploma in public finance management, and research like this helps me see if the type of competencies that we are trying to impart to our students are actually realistic to in relation to the jobs that they have to do on the ground. It's also very important to inform public policy debate. As everybody probably knows, there's this new Public Procurement Act, which will come in to effect quite soon, and also the PFMA and MFMA are being revised. So it's a good time for an evidence base to inform those processes. Now, I'm going to focus in my research on municipalities that are already compliant, that are already functional. When I present the research, a lot of people ask me, but why are you focusing on municipalities that are not the problem, right? When there are so many dysfunctional municipalities out there whose supply chain management systems are in disarray. And so, one of the reasons for focusing on compliant municipalities is that much of the research in South Africa focuses on dysfunction, what doesn't work, instead of trying to understand what does work, right? Remember that there are only a few ways of doing things right, but there are millions of permutations in terms of doing things wrong, right? But from a research methodology point of view, the compelling reason is that, when you look at supply chain management outcomes in a municipality or any public sector organization, it's really a function not only of the regulations, but also the implementation of those regulations. And if the municipality doesn't have systems, doesn't have capacity, posts are unfilled, then it's very difficult to isolate what are the contributing factors which are emanating from the design of the regulatory framework itself and those which are being caused by governance issues, capacity, etc. So by focusing on municipalities who don't have capacity constraints, where the implementation is not that much of a problem, you can actually focus more on whether the design of the regulatory system has inherent issues, right? So that was one of the reasons why we chose to focus on the sample that we did. The other reason is that the voices of municipalities are seldom heard, despite the fact that they are implementers of critical services. So we know that there's organized local government, for example, SALGA, but it's highly unlikely that one organization will be able to represent more than 250 municipalities, which have very different delivery and political and socio-economic context, especially when it comes to technical discussions. So one of the limitations of this research is that it focuses primarily on a municipal view. So we didn't go out and also speak to national treasury and provincial treasuries, etc., while we were doing the research. But we did actually end up holding a technical seminar for Western Cape Treasury, where they invited KZN Treasury in the Eastern Cape and one other treasury that doesn't come to mind at the moment. But to just reinforce that the object of the research was actually to look at municipalities and get their views. The research was conducted from April 2022 to August 2023. So it was still done under the auspices of the Municipal Finance Management Act, or MFMA. Our problem statement is this, and it's reflected in the research title, Balancing SCM Probity with Performance. Probity really refers to the fact that we need stewardship of these funds because these are public funds. We need to comply, right? And so we need safeguards to make sure that that money is not misappropriated or there isn't waste or fraud or corruption or whatever. But on the other hand, we also need to design processes that don't retard delivery. And what's happened in South Africa in the public sector is that because of the rising tide of fraud, maladministration, state capture, etc., which, for example, the Auditor General's report highlights every single year, and often these are serially recurring violations. This situation has resulted in increased regulation. But unfortunately, when we look at this increased regulation, it hasn't really hindered any municipalities that really wanted to be corrupt. So those who are unwilling or unable to comply simply don't, and there's very little enforcement and consequence management. So they really don't impose costs on municipalities who don't comply. But the increasing complexity and the stringency and rigidity um, does impose specific and very substantial costs on municipalities who are actually trying to comply. So we ended up with the worst of all worlds. The regulatory regime is not really inhibiting malpractice or malfeasance for those municipalities who aren't compliant. But for those municipalities who are compliant, it's really imposing quite a lot of costs, and these costs have actually increased. And what I'll try and unpack in this presentation is why is it so costly? We often hear that government pays 10 times more for things than what could be purchased on the open market, right? And often when the public hears about this, our initial thought is, oh, there must be some stealing going on, right? What I want to try and convince you in this presentation is that even if there is no stealing, because of the design of these SEM regulations, it will still result in higher costs to government in terms of procurement. Okay, so I think we must be clear that the aim of this research, the premise on which it departed, wasn't that we need to do away with controls and safeguards and audits, etc., etc., but that we need to try and find ways to streamline these so that they don't overly compromise delivery effectiveness. So what I'm going to start with is I'll talk to the research design. Then we'll move on to what are some of the key findings. And then finally, I'll come with some recommendations or conclusions. So when we looked at all of these research areas, including supply chain management, we were asking what are the bottlenecks and trade-offs between SEM probity and compliance on the one hand and municipal SEM performance on the other hand. And then based on that analysis, how is it possible to improve so that we get a better balance between probity and compliance on the one hand and performance of municipalities on the other hand. As I mentioned before, we looked at a number of regulatory focused areas, both financial and non-financial, of which supply chain management is one. Right at the end of this presentation, I will show you a link which will be to the full report in case you're interested in that. But in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on supply chain management exclusively. So in terms of research methodology, as I said, we were looking at municipalities who were already compliant. We excluded the metros because we felt that the metros were already well researched, given that the South African Cities Network frequently published state of city finances reports, etc., etc. We also were not focusing on dysfunctional municipalities, either in relation to their financial or operational performance, because under those circumstances, it's very difficult to distinguish what are the effects which are being caused by the design of the regulation and what are the effects which come through due to factors like capacity, implementation, governance, etc., that impact on the implementation side. And we try to get at least 4 provinces, but unfortunately we were not successful. We wrote to all of the municipalities that met our criteria, but because participation is voluntary, what we ended up with was those municipalities that actually responded to us and said, yes, we'd like to participate in your study. And those were Midrand Municipality in Gauteng, and then Cape Winelands District, Mossel Bay, Overstrand, and Saldanha. So you'll notice that the overwhelming majority of them are in the Western Cape. But then again, that's hardly surprising if you consider that the municipalities that have unqualified financial audits, many of them are actually most of them are in the Western Cape. So we allowed them to have some emphasis of matter in terms of regulatory findings, but we were generally looking for unqualified financial findings, mainly as the proxy for compliance orientation and capacity to comply. So those were the municipalities that we examined, all of those regulatory areas, and I want to hone in on supply chain management. Like I said earlier, it's one of the most highly regulated functions. It's audited often because of the high risk associated, but at the end of the day, it's still been subject to flagrant abuse. As I mentioned before, there's quite a lot of legislative change in the offing for the sector. The section on supply chain management, which was in the Municipal Finance Management Act, is now forming part of the Public Procurement Bill, which was passed by Parliament on the 25th of May. But all that's left is for the president to just sign that, and when the president assents, now that we actually do have a president, hopefully we'll have a cabinet to complement that soon. But when the president assents, then that piece of legislation will then come in force and supersede the MFMA. So unlike the past, where there's been multiple pieces of legislation dealing with procurement, and I'll touch on some of them, the original aim of this public procurement bill was to have a single unified framework. But yeah, as I'll discuss later, the bill was quite a disappointment to me because instead of solving some of these issues, it defers most of the detail to regulations. So it hasn't done, in my opinion, an incredibly good job of clarifying some of these things. Okay, so one of the key findings was that when you look at supply chain regulation, because it's so fragmented and it's so complicated, not everybody interprets the regulations in the same way. So you might find that the way the municipalities interpret it is different from the way National Treasury, Office of the Chief Procurement Officer interprets it, which may differ from the way the provincial treasuries interpret it. And then the AG comes along and they have their own interpretation as well, right? So when you look at municipalities, they have to go and get hold of expensive legal opinions because many of them, especially the smaller ones, don't have an in-house legal department. And often SCM issues are so complex and specialized that the existing legal personnel might not be able to deal with it. And it's also a very litigious domain because disgruntled bidders who didn't get the tenders that they applied for will often challenge the process, etc., etc. So what it makes SCM different from other sectors of municipal accounting or municipal financial management is that court decisions mean that the regulatory environment is constantly evolving. Okay, so I'll just give you one example of this, and then I'll touch on one or two more examples so you can actually get the picture. So if you look at Regulation 32 of the PFMA, it says, that when one municipality has gone through due process in terms of its supply chain management process to have a competitive tender and a tender is awarded, then another municipality can piggyback on that contract, provided that there's permission from the original municipality entering into the contract and that the service provider agrees, right? However, these some recent court judgments, like Quadakuza Municipality versus Skillful and another, in that court case, the court said, okay, you can piggyback, but you can only piggyback on the remainder of the contract. So the second municipality can only utilize what the first municipality who originally entered into the contract hasn't really used, right? And this was a different direction from how it had been interpreted by municipalities until then. Okay, this interpretation was then confirmed by National Treasury in MFMA Circular 96 in July 2019. But this is an example of where court cases have actually changed interpretations, which means that municipalities must constantly be doing research and try to understand how the dynamic is changing. Otherwise, they could fall foul of regulatory requirements. Also, when you look at broad-based Black economic empowerment regulations, which municipalities have also to comply with, there have been disruptive court cases like AfriForum versus Minister of Finance, where the minister's power to regulate on set-asides was called into question by the court. And in fact, this was one of the reasons why the public procurement bill had to be enacted, to basically respond to this is one of the issues that that bill had to respond to. But I think that what makes municipal ECM regulation difficult is the fact that it's not just about procuring goods and services at the right prices in order to deliver service. There are so many other objectives which municipalities have to comply with. So, for instance, industrial policy uses SEM to further local content regulations. Certain goods are designated by DTI, and municipalities have to procure locally. But sometimes not all specialized equipment, etc., is actually produced locally. Also, municipalities reported that they had no system of checking the local content before they awarded the bid. After the bid was awarded, they could then send it to DTI to verification. But a lot of the CFOs said, like, what's the point of doing this after the fact? So often there are these laudable policy goals, but the practical systems to implement them is not often there. And so, while the kind of received wisdom in the academic literature is that, if you comply and there's probity, you will then have good performance and delivery, right? What came out from our study is that there's actually a trade-off between probity and performance in well-performing municipalities, and that some of the SEM competitive market requirements can actually result in poorer access to service providers and greater cost, which is completely counterintuitive to any member of the public sitting out there. So, for example, one of the municipalities that we interviewed reported that they were going to buy a bakkie. Actually, I think it was 3 bakkies, and they wanted that the service provider be located within their geographic jurisdiction, or have a partner in their geographic jurisdiction who could service the bakkie. Right, and a part of the reason was that this municipality was a far distance from the city, so was 4 hours drive from the city, and if an official had to take the bakkie, drive for 4 hours, then wait for the bakkie to be repaired, they might have to stay overnight, so that's S&T and accommodation costs. So all of this increases cost to the municipality. However, the AG said that this requirement by the municipality was actually anti-competitive, right? And then later on, the courts actually confirmed this in Beigen Africa Services and others versus the City of Cape Town. Now, as an outsider, it seemed to me that this requirement, that the service provider be close at hand, is not a ridiculous requirement, right? Same when we look at things like subcontracting. So, not only are you looking at value for money, but the SCM is also being used to try and stimulate small business, black-owned business, um, disabled business, youth business, etc., youth-owned business, etc. So, when you look at the MFMA regulations, and it's been cut and paste directly into the procurement bill. So if you look at section 19.1 of the procurement bill, it says where feasible, a procuring institution must subcontract a contract above the prescribed threshold to advance certain categories of persons or small companies, right? Now the municipalities were saying they don't want this where feasible. Okay, that the legislation must either say you must subcontract, right? Okay, or it must make it clear that it's discretionary whether to subcontract or not. Because one of the municipalities in the sample said that they didn't subcontract to a BEE provider because they didn't feel it was feasible. But then the AG came and said, well, where's your feasibility study? So the implication is that every time there is a contract, you must now conduct a feasibility market testing exercise before you can justify a decision to subcontract or not subcontract. Right? Okay. So the point that the municipality was trying to make is that it's very unclear. And if I look at the latest iteration of this act, which was assented to by Parliament, that lack of clarity has just fed over into the new legislation. Okay, so where the new procurement bill does actually make a slight improvement over the previous MFMA regulations is that in the previous MFMA regulation, one of the points that the municipal respondents raised was that when they heard the term local economic development, they thought that it meant stimulating the economy in your municipality, right? But they were disappointed to find that in terms of DTI policies, local economic development refers to anywhere in South Africa, right? Whereas now, if you look at the public procurement bill, it does allow for geographic designations as well, right? However, how this is going to work, we're going to have to wait until we see how those regulations pan out. What is important is that when you consider all of these different requirements that municipalities have to comply with, it can undermine infrastructure rollout. So, if you think that it's not only the MFMA or public procurement bill, SEM regulations, preferential procurement framework, there's also CIDB standards, then there's National Treasury capital asset management guidelines and planning guidelines, then there's the municipal asset transfer regulations. You can actually see how dense the regulatory maze is that municipalities will have to navigate. And I think that there's still a fair amount of uncertainty about future local content procurement directions. As I said before, the procurement bill is going to leave it to regulations to decide this. But from my reading of the bill itself, it seems that there's going to be a lot more latitude for different municipalities to frame their policies in different ways, which is going to be very confusing to service providers, because they will have to understand how this varies across different municipalities if they provide services across different municipalities. And it might also expose municipal finance officials, SEM officials, to a lot more political pressure than they have now. Um, the electronic systems that you need to really deal with SAM are lacking, even in quite high capacity municipalities who are not metros. The procurement bill requires the Procurement Regulation Office to develop this IT system. And there's a lot of new technologies like AI, blockchain, and all of that that could be quite useful. But in my mind, I think that if National Treasury and CETA could not get their act together to roll out the IFMIS, right, for more than a decade, how soon will it take to actually have these SEM systems in place? ECM capacity is lacking, especially in smaller and more rural municipalities. So, for example, if you look at an earlier iteration of the ECM regulations, it said that 4 senior managers need to sit on a bid committee. But some municipalities only have 3 senior managers, right? So, luckily, that was changed to say you can get a visiting senior management, right? Okay, manager to sit on that committee. But this, in my mind, provides evidence that a lot of these regulations are aimed at big municipalities, like metros, etc., and not really at the small municipalities who may not have the resources. So even if you think of the framework for infrastructure delivery and procurement management, where the gateways need to be signed off. Initially, the first draft of that regulation required it to be signed off by a registered engineer. But many small municipalities just don't have registered engineers. Okay, fortunately, there have been changes there, but it's important that regulation design should be more sensitive to the fact that we've got such a variety of capacity in the local government sphere. So I think that for now, in terms of our recommendations, I'm hoping that the procurement bill will clarify in regulation a lot of these interpretation issues, because otherwise this regulatory uncertainty is going to continue. I think that there should be a balance between discretion, what municipalities can do, with consistency, rather than leaving everything up to individual councils and municipal managers. And also clearly, ensure that there is some degree of standardization so that we don't increase the transaction cost to the private sector to deal with different municipalities. Maybe try and improve this local content verification system so that it's not after the fact, right? And also, when there are court cases that impact on regulation, we can't just have things like moratoriums. Now, with the AfriForum case, National Treasury issued a statement which they later said wasn't a moratorium. But when I read it, I interpreted it to be a moratorium. Whether it was a moratorium or not, that statement created more uncertainty than decreasing uncertainty. And the role of the regulator is to actually try and create more certainty so that those who need to comply, those organizations actually do comply. Right. And the more certainty that's created, the less need for expensive legal opinions. The current CSD database functionality could be improved. I know National Treasury is already doing a lot of work there, but more could be done there. Okay, so I think that the municipalities also said that often there are small technical issues which are not material, but in the public's eye, you can't distinguish between that and more serious infractions. So, for example, one municipality said we were going to advertise a tender which should have been advertised for 180 days through human error. It was advertised for 179 days, and then we ended up with issues with the Auditor General, right? Now, in the legal approach is that you look at substantive compliance. I mean, this is what the courts look at. But if you look at what the AG is looking at, they are looking at 100% compliance. And it's not obvious to communities out there where something is just a technical deviation and where it's actually like real fraud and corruption. Also, there is more emphasis on electronic systems, and I think that it's very important to consult subnational governments if they have to use these systems to make sure that the systems actually work in those environments. Then more guidance from central regulators, especially this new public procurement office that's going to be created to help mitigate some of the varying interpretations and lack of certainty. And when regulations are being designed, the impact should be assessed in terms of whether all municipalities in the sphere have the capability to actually comply. So to conclude, I think that when you look at well-performing municipalities, there's definitely a trade-off between SCM, probity, and performance, right? Okay. Just bear in mind that for other municipalities that are dysfunctional, maybe that trade-off doesn't exist. Remember that we only sampled compliant municipalities. So I feel that we can make this statement about these municipalities and similar municipalities, but it may be that for less functional municipalities, that possibly some of these controls are justified. What was also interesting was that there's substantial deviation over time between what the MFMA legislation kind of prescribed and how the subsequent waves of regulation have interpreted that. But one of the main reasons for the complexity of the regulation is we are trying to do too many things. We are expecting the municipalities to do too many things in terms of supply chain management. They have to look at triple BEE, they have to look at local content. Now it's climate change and everything must be green and all of that. And, for municipalities that are already struggling, it's not surprising that the main objective of SCM is not achieved by all of these other objectives that are also being tacked onto it. Instead of creating new regulations, we need better enforcement of existing regulations, right? And often the legal opinions that municipalities get are vetoed by the AG as well. So having a legal opinion doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing the right thing. And there are often quite tight compliance timelines for having to complete all of these things. When there are changes to regulation or policy, then the unclear guidance or lack of direction from regulators can make the regulatory burden even bigger. And it's important that we actually try and get a common understanding of how we interpret supply chain management. So you can look at the full report here, and that will conclude my presentation. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen, and then we can move over to questions. Right. Nobuntu, any questions?
Thank you, Tanya. There is no questions on the chat, but I would encourage people to put their questions or clarity on the chat, or they can come in and ask questions. Are there any questions on the floor?
Elaine, you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. This was wonderful, absolutely a wonderful session. Thank you so much that you allowed us to twist your arm to come, and I can see the questions is now coming in thick and fast. I was just wondering when you made the distinction between the ability of your metros and your smaller municipalities. And I'm not familiar with the procurement systems at the municipal or provincial level. Do you think it would be a solution? I'm not sure. So procurement, does it happen at municipal level, or is there some of the procurement, if it goes above a certain threshold, that must be done at a national or a provincial level? And this takes me to my question. Do you think it's a solution if procurement is sort of consolidated at a higher level, let's say provincial or district level, especially when it comes to the capacities at your more rural municipalities? Because I'm also aware of the fact that money, people always think, the society thinks, citizens think there isn't money. But National Treasury, a lot of money gets returned to National Treasury simply because municipalities don't get to or don't finalize the procurement they're supposed to do within the financial year. Thanks.
Yeah, so I want to agree with you that I'll come to the other hands later. I want to agree with you that often, there's lack of spending, and especially in infrastructure, that is the case. But with municipalities, your municipal manager has got the budget, and he delegates authority to CFO, etc., to spend, right? If a municipality wants to maybe use a centralized procurement system, it will be the decision of that municipality, right? Now remember that local government is a separate sphere of government, so you can't impose. So, for example, a national government could tell the provinces, you have to use a centralized system, but you can't tell that. Right? Okay, it falls outside the public service. So it would have to be voluntary, right? But for that centralization to work, you'll need to have a very good IT system, right? If the IT system is problematic and actually increases wasting time or doesn't decrease cost, then there will be very little incentive for that sort of centralization to work. So I hope that helped a bit. Ntutuzelo, you've got your hand up, and then Strova after that.
Thank you, Tanya. My questions are not coming out of the presentation as such, but they are general in terms of my experiences under SCM, and perhaps maybe you can provide some pointers in terms of your experience, or perhaps communicate your responses later. The first one relates to panels and contract extensions. I've experienced problems in requests for panel extensions, and I fail to understand the logic when a panel, for an example, has been created in a competitive process, that same cannot be extended, just like the contract. I would like your views around that. The second one is around fairness under Section 217 of the Constitution. I find difficulty in getting joy with the auditors when it comes to the interpretation of fairness, because there are no guidelines. The general response would be that there is a bidder out there that I don't even know, or not even the auditors can point out, that may have been prejudiced in a process. I find it difficult to reconcile that when I know that there are a couple of bidders that have responded and they were treated in the same way within that bid process. The issue of fairness is very broad. I'm not sure if perhaps there are some decided cases that you are aware of that deal specifically with the interpretation of what is fair and not fair in a procurement process. That's the second one. The last one on my side is around partnership or partnerships with institutions like the universities. For an example, your procurement rules are rigid in terms of how you must conduct a procurement process. Is there a way perhaps that we can find a way of working with institutions like universities without necessarily be limited to what is available under the Treasury regulations or PFMA in relation to procurement, which is your your procurement in terms of Treasury Regulation 16. Thanks.
Okay, Slovet, you want to come in, and then I can give a response to both of you.
Thanks for the presentation and making available the research. It's informative. My question relates to probity reports. What do you suggest we should, a municipality, do a probity report before terms of reference are issued or after the procurement process has been done? And I am mindful of the fact that probity reports are also a cost to the municipality. But when it's done after and you pick up all the non-compliance, it becomes an audit query. But when you do it before, it's costly for each and every terms of reference to go through a probity report process. Thanks.
I love that question because it kind of shows whichever way you go, there's going to be a cost somehow, right? If you have the report before, you might reduce the cost of non-compliance, but then you have to pay for it, right? So I feel that we shouldn't be doing ex ante on a across the board basis. I think maybe you can have a risk-based, assessment, but I think that at the end of the day, ex post is quite important, and it's worthwhile putting the money there because the function of an ex post report is on accountability, right? I would hope that management would be looking at the ex ante processes before then. I think it just becomes too cumbersome and unwieldy to have both an ex post or both an ex ante and an ex post. But I do think it would be interesting to do some research on that area. I mean, I'm just giving you my gut feel, but I think that this might be an area to more systematically look at the cost and benefits. Okay, and then I wanted to get back to Zelo, who raised a number of points. On the extension of panels and the concession of contracts, I agree with you. I can't see any compelling reason or any substantive increasing in risk associating with extending the panel as well, right? So I agree with you there. On your issue about what constitutes fairness in SAM, wow, there's a whole lot of case law on that, and I'm not even I'm not a lawyer, but my colleague, Prof. Hioquino, at the they have the African Procurement Center, right? And he also teaches a lot of courses on this. The problem is that there's so many different dimensions to what constitutes fairness. And as I said before, it's constantly evolving. right? And it's funny because the courts look at how the AG interprets, right? And often supports what the AG has interpreted. But there have been cases where the courts have actually said to the AG, well, you've been wrong, right? Really it comes down to who is the owner of that regulation, and that is National Treasury. Now it will be the Procurement Regulation Office, to make sure that legislation is in the first instance clear. Rather than trying to end up with different interpretations thereafter. Okay, in terms of partnerships with universities, I don't know if the procurement latest procurement act deals with that. I'll have to look at it again. But one thing that it did make clear, that where different organs of state interact with each other, that should not be considered an arm's length transaction. So I think that that's quite useful, right? But how that would work out, we really need to understand, how the regulations are actually framed. Okay, there's also a question in the, Khotso, I see you've got your hand up. Yes, Nobuntu?
Afternoon,
No, I was just gonna-
colleagues.
Afternoon, Koto. I was just going to read out your question, but hence your hand is up. Then you can go ahead and raise your question.
All right. Okay, my name is Khoto. I'm from Municipal Local Municipality in the Free State. I think my question is regarding the panel. We may find that we have a panel of service providers, 5 of them in the same panel, but now we have to rotate them. How did you ensure that, because they have different prices, how do you ensure that we are doing that without blowing the budget of the municipality? Thank you.
I have absolutely no idea. But that's a very good question, right? So if I look at how the regulation is framed, there's this implicit assumption that there are going to be lots of providers in the market and that the market is really competitive, right? But as we pointed out, if your municipality is like somewhere in a deep rural area, there may not be very many service providers. So I can understand the rationale for rotation of service providers, right? Because you don't want collusion, you want a competitive market. But if there aren't service providers, all the other service providers are so costly. So I often wonder why, before we promulgate regulation, we don't do a bit more regulatory impact to see how feasible it is, and if it would actually work. So Khotso, that's a very good question. I'm going to think about it. Maybe we can do some research on it in future. And I think definitely when it comes to the new public procurement bill regulations, these are the type of practical things that we need to raise. Cheats, you've got your hand up.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks. So my question really, you commented about SEM and infrastructure. And what we're finding is that municipalities try to preempt their infrastructure procurement, right? But there isn't a guarantee that the money will be coming through. What we have found in some, as you put it, well-performing municipalities, that they do the TOR in what they call in a ready-to-roll kind of action, so that they start it in January, and if the money comes through, they are able to then do it in, say, July when it is. What's your thoughts on this kind of approach where one is issuing tenders, but you don't really know whether you've got the money? Because we've also found that some of the grant money may or may not be guaranteed, to be the full amount into future years.
Look, I think you have to be very careful about the legal status of that, right? Because if you give the impression that it is actually going to go ahead, as opposed to just market testing, then I think you could have issues with bidders right? But I think to the extent that you can handle that grand risk, it's actually a very smart move. Because if funds are not spent, and I think Elaine raised that issue, and you've got a so-called shovel-ready project there that you can initiate. So if you can kind of look for some sort of pre-qualification, that or panels, that might be able to reconcile some of the issues.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Any last questions or comments? Okay, so I think that we've been quite effective and efficient. Oh, Abram, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, yes, everybody. Aubrey Vermeulen. I'm a civil engineer. I work in the water sector. I'm independent. I've worked a great deal for and with municipalities, so it's been really interesting. I think it is a great piece of work that's been done, and I think generally I agree with all the points that you made. What was just interesting in the last point, you said that there's an implicit assumption that there's a lot of service providers and that the market is competitive. And I just think that is fundamentally an incorrect assumption. I mean, I've been in the water sector for 30 years. I know everyone in the sector. And, if you have a person in a municipality, they can tell you who's the guys that can do this work. They'll know if whatever they deal with, there's a few of them. So how do we move towards, I mean, obviously we want to prevent misappropriation of public funds, but in the end, it's also, you have to trust the person, the technical person that's driving it, his professionality, that he actually knows what he's doing. So, we've often had, when there's been questions, when I worked in the Department of Water and Sanitation, there'd be questions, but why is it always just these 6 companies that tender? And you're like, well, those are the only 6 that do it. There isn't anybody else. So, and I think often with panels, municipalities, like for spares and support services, they do term tenders, and that's a much better way of, a supplier will guarantee a certain part at a certain price over a period. So then the municipality doesn't have to, keep the stock in their stores. They actually outsource that risk. But when it's like one of the speakers said, when you try and extend those things, they'll say, no, you can't extend it. And it's like, you need to give others a chance. But if you're in a metro, it's different. But if you sit in a small town, you know exactly what the suppliers are. So anyway, maybe I'm talking a bit too much, but I remember in one project that we did in the Northern Cape, it was actually near Uppington, and there was only one water pump supplier that had an office in Uppington. So we basically said, we want this brand of pumps because we know, and that's like, we're still 150 kilometers from where we were, but we know that's the only one that's there. But now people will say, oh, but you being selective. We are being selective, yes, because of the practical knowledge that we have, not because we're trying to, be underhanded. So I think that's the thing. Luckily, at that time, the company I was working for agreed that that is the best sensible option because everybody in the area used the same pumps for the reason that they have an office and they have backup support. So there's often very practical reasons where you have to, like I said, accept the technical person's knowledge. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I think that you're asking a very good question, and luckily, the National Planning Commission, they commissioned a very interesting paper. You can download the paper. It's by Ron Watermeyer and Sean Phillips, right? And they I make my students read this, right? Okay. And they say that the fundamental problem with the way our supply chain management regulation have been designed, right? MFMA, PFMA, and now this procurement bill is just a cut and paste. Right, okay, and it's just cutting and pasted and put it in. It hasn't fundamentally thought about what we needed to do. Treats every commodity as if it is stationary, right? Your stationery is standard. It's a competitive market. One pencil is pretty much as good as another, right? But especially when you look at infrastructure, you might be building bridges, but the cost structure can differ so much, according to the topography of the terrain, the rainfall, temperatures, all of those things that engineers look at and, I don't look at, right? Okay. So I think that what we really need to look at is how do we deal with infrastructure procurement completely different from the way we deal with stationery and all this office stuff, which is standardized projects. And there needs to be more engineers involved, right? Okay, and rather than finance people. So I think we need to look at that, especially, and the other area is also IT systems, procurement of IT systems. More and more, we're going to become, moving into the AI, fourth industrial revolution. But how we procure our AI systems, right? Our large ICT systems is not really catered well for in our current regulation. Okay, so I think that in an ideal world, we would be able to trust officials to actually deliver, right? And if you look at the municipalities in our sample, for example, Mossel Bay, they've had a clean audit for the last like 10 years or something like that consecutively. I would trust them and I would trust their systems. But because we have so many municipalities that are not well run, we are actually going to make it almost impossible to deliver quickly for everybody, right? So, the issue that you raised about the one pump, it just made me smile because it's exactly the sort of scenario that we've also come across. But I think that the one thing that can make a difference is, if we use technologies such as AI, then we can actually look at what are the prevailing competitive prices by geographic area, by sector, right? Okay, to a very specific level, okay, right down to individual parts. We can also use it to distinguish between what needs to be imported, right? Okay, and what comes from other parts of the country, right? Okay, so then, instead of having anti checks and balances, right? We can then, have, more accurate information to do ex post accountability, etc. But that's not going to work if you don't have, proper commitment to consequence management, right? And to follow up on, if there are control weaknesses, etc. But I think that unfortunately, we're not enforcing these regulations where they must be enforced, right? And so it's not making a difference there. And for those municipalities who are actually trying to comply, their costs are just increasing enormously. And I think the point that was made about rotation of service providers. Unfortunately, is when markets are just have a few players in them, right? Okay, and also the few players that are there tend to operate at scale. So when you have a new entrants, the prices are typically higher, because they don't have the footprint, they're not operating at that scale. So you might achieve the industrial policy objective, trying to stimulate business, but it's going to result in increased costs, right? And possibly increased waiting time if the production capacity to produce at scale, within short times isn't there. Okay, let me just go and see if there are any comments on the chat. I think we base. Oh, any thoughts on organs of state using Takealot or Amazon, etc., or online travel agent type services? Well, online travel agent type services could work, right? But then you have to weigh that up against what is the efficiency of doing it in-house if you have the scale, right? I just want to comment on Takealot and Amazon. Not Takealot, but Amazon. India has actually banned Amazon, right? Because what they discovered was that Amazon would use their platform to know how demand is going to evolve on various things, right? Then they go in and they establish companies or they take over companies to be able to meet that demand, right? Okay. So more and more of the economy is actually going to end up being run by foreigners, right? So there's a lot of geopolitics involved, right? And you also have to think about things like job creation. If you're ordering from Amazon, you're basically ordering from China, right? Okay, because ultimately most of those stuff come from China, right? So then, what are your customs duties, etc., going to be? And are you willing to give up those jobs that could potentially be created here? So I think the point is that while it might save money for an individual institution, what is going to be the social impact on the economy, right? And then what happens if there is a bug in Amazon system and they can no longer supply, right? We saw with COVID that even global supply chains can be disrupted. So, we can maybe use those channels, but you would have to diversify those channels because otherwise, your risk would become unacceptable. Okay, so I think that we're pretty much kind of wrapping up. Nobuntu, I'm going to hand back to you at this juncture.
Thank you, Professor Ajam. I think we are almost done. Every questions on the chat, they've been answered. And thank you very much for such an insightful presentation. And I just wanted to remind attendees that the full presentation will be shared on our social media and our GTech Knowledge Hub on our website. And then again, just to remind you, please take time again to rate us. How was the presentation on the link that was shared on the forms? And thank you, everyone. Have a very good afternoon.
Yep, and have a very good weekend as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the research. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.